It's been almost 127 years since the first paying public screening of Moving Images by the Lumière brothers on the 28th of December 1895 took place in Paris, and it was a roaring success. Since then, cinema and television have evolved into a staple form of entertainment, but, more importantly, central to how we construct social narratives about ourselves. Be it through the written or spoken word, art or moving images, these forms of storytelling have become the equivalent of sitting around the communal fire and constructing stories about the best and worst of humanity, deconstructing who we are and giving meaning to our existence. When put in terms like that, storytelling becomes something more than just frivolous entertainment. It's a way to expose ourselves to ourselves, a way to provoke, reframe, and influence. So how we tell our stories, who tells them, who is included and who is not, who is framed as the hero and who is framed as the villain, matters. Come with me as I take you through a history of sapphic representation in film and TV, from the silent films where we get our first sapphic kiss on celluloid, to the invisible years where homosexuality was routinely censored, to the slow 50-year emergence from that era. When was the first lesbian film made? How have sapphic women been portrayed in film and TV over the decades? What are the landmark moments that have helped move the needle forward? I'll be looking at that and more in this history of sapphic film and TV. The presence of queerness in cinema was there from the start. In fact, an experiment in 1895 to synchronize sound and image saw two men dancing a short pas de deux, and it was titled the Dickinson Experimental Sound Film, or I've also seen it called The Gay Brothers. The men themselves were probably not gay, but it is to my knowledge the first queer image, if you will, to ever be captured. If you're curious, I have linked to a video of this along with links to a lot of the other films referenced in this video. The use of queer images were, in fact, quite common. In the early days, moving images were shown anywhere a screen in a dark space could be put up. This could be a fairground or a music hall where vaudeville shows were performed. Vaudeville was popular until the 1930s and was a form of entertainment where various acts would be performed, from comedic skits to circus acts. Among those acts, you might expect to see men and women dressing up as the opposite sex. You may know about this from the popular sapphic miniseries Tipping the Velvet. That they influenced the experimental world of film is hardly surprising. In fact, cross-dressing for comedic effect seems something of a staple in the early days of comedy. Examples of this can be seen in 1912's Making a Man of Her, in which a woman dresses up as a man to get a job, and 1914's A Florida Enchantment, in which a woman swallows a magic seed which turns her into a man. Superficially, these films are queer. In Making a Man of Her, we see two women take a particular interest in the protagonist that persists even once the ruse is up. In A Florida Enchantment, we see two women dancing together and the female protagonist flirting with a woman. Once she cuts her hair and starts wearing men's clothes, she's accepted as being male and gets engaged. However, the resolution of these films is the return to the status quo. There is no real queer narrative here. The gender swapping is for the comedy of errors that arises from the gender bending and doesn't place a critical eye on gender or gender expression, except in its attempt to reinforce what is normal and therefore good by society's standards, that is, cis heterosexuality. In Ich möchte kein Mann sein, I don't want to be a man, the gender bending is used to highlight how restricted the protagonist is as a woman. She ends up falling for a potential suitor when she gets drunk and makes out with him while masquerading as a man, and while there is no apparent issue given to the suitor thinking that he's kissing a man, in the end she decides being a man is hard and reverts to presenting as a female. The interesting part about these and other similar films of the time is how the woman dressed as a man is considered far more palatable than the man dressing as a woman. The societal default being male and the weaker sex being female, a woman in men's clothing served to reinforce the superiority of the patriarchal paradigm. It was the effeminate men known as sissies that were to be feared. It was therefore they who were the true butt of jokes and a source of ridicule in these early films. In A Florida Enchantment, it is the man dressed as a woman who is chased into a river and then drowns, while the woman dressed as a man looks on from the safety of her room. As Vito Russo in the book The Celluloid Closet points out, while sissy men have always signalled a rank betrayal of the myth of male superiority, tomboy women have seemed to reinforce that myth and have often been indulged in acting it out. We see it in moments like the 1930 film Morocco, which features a brief kiss between protagonist Amy and a woman. But far from being sapphic representation, it was used for the sensational effect in a time where censorship wasn't yet being enforced seriously. That was to come. And it didn't detract from the heterosexual triangle that was the core romance of the movie. Using two women kissing for sensationalism is something that has persisted, as we'll discuss later, and we see it in fact with the very first lesbian kiss on celluloid. It was during an orgy scene in the 1922 film Manslaughter. The presence of the kiss, a perfunctory blink and you miss it moment, was there merely to show the debauched depravity of ancient Rome as a contrast to good Christian values. 10 years later, in 1932, the director of the film, Cecil B. DeMille, made another film where he used lesbianism as a shorthand, again, for the depravity of the Roman Empire during the rise of Christianity, among other things. It also featured a rather disturbing dance where a Roman woman tries, I guess, to seduce the good Christian girl. Apparently, the outcry at this content was in no small way responsible for the US censorship code knuckling down on displays of depravity in 1934. In Germany, however, following the end of World War I and before the Nazis got into power in 1933, there was a brief reprieve in their censorship that allowed the emergence of the first gay and lesbian films. Anderes als die anderen, Different from the Others, in 1919, took a sympathetic look at male homosexuality and was the work of homosexual reform advocates, even if it still ended with tragedy. The first lesbian film, Mädchen in Uniform, or Girls in Uniform, would take another 12 years to be made. In the meantime, there was one notable lesbian character also in a German production, one that is far more sympathetic than I honestly expected. Die Box de Pandora, or Pandora's Box, in 1929, gave us the first lesbian character in a film where Countess Anne Geschwitz is infatuated with the protagonist, Lulu. Amongst the whirlwind devastation the ardor Lulu engenders in both men and, well, one woman, Countess Geschwitz, at least from my modern perspective, appears a largely unproblematic portrayal of a sapphic character. Perhaps her jealous gaze would have at the time seemed predatory and unpalatable, but she never steps over any boundaries and, in fact, is willing to sacrifice much for Lulu's safety. Her lesbianism does lead to a bad ending for her. In an attempt to save Lulu from her downward spiral, she flirts and is, it looks like, raped by a man, so it's not a hopeful portrayal by any stretch. She is suitably punished for her deviance, a theme that will be oft repeated in the coming century. But she herself was not presented as a villain or a predator, but at least to me, a rather sympathetic character. 3 years later, in 1931, Mädchen in Uniform was released as the first lesbian film. Protagonist Manuela is a newly arrived student at a girls' boarding school who develops a romantic attachment to her teacher. This film was based on a play and was generally well received internationally, although there were, in fact, 2 endings to this film. In one, Manuela commits suicide by jumping from the stairwell. In the other, she is rescued by her classmates. The tragic version was used in the US and much of continental Europe because, of course, lesbianism must be punished. Additional editing was also made to take out any allusions to lesbianism from the film. The film, incidentally, only made it to the US because Eleanor Roosevelt, being the sapphic that she was a fan of the movie. This film, like Die Box de Pandora, paints the lesbian character of Manuela without villainizing her. What it does, though, is lean into the narrative that her deviant tendencies drive her insane.
Geheilt? Wovon denn? Du darfst mich nicht so lieb haben. Warum?
2 years later, the Nazi Party got into power and burnt Anderes als die anderen, and it was thought lost for many decades. It now exists as a reconstruction of the original only. Mädchen in Uniform escaped such a fate because, back then, women's sexuality was still something of a myth and it didn't challenge status quo in the same way gay men did. I think it also had something to do with the fact that Mädchen in Uniform, along with a number of other sapphic films set in all-girls boarding schools, could be dismissed as pubescent girls exploring burgeoning sexuality in the safety of same-sex affection until the real men came along to sweep them up in perfectly heterosexual relationships. This sentiment is well encapsulated in the 1957 film The Twilight Girls.
I'm used to loves and hatreds among you girls. They're not forever. Now don't you cry over it. The few years you're here at Berlin are really just a short prologue to your life out there. Before you become the wives and mothers you will be, you are these mysterious, secretive little twilight girls. No longer children, but not yet women.
With Germany coming under Nazi rule in 1933 and with the US, already the leader of the international film industry, tightening their codes, the progressive films dwindled and sapphic representation, when allowed to exist, would not live up to these humble beginnings. While European cinema led the way initially, the First World War saw Hollywood solidify itself as the global leader. The 1930s ushered in the Great Depression, where cinema attendance dropped dramatically as punters struggled to afford tickets. In response, the film industry used more scandalous plots to attract eyeballs.
Take off your clothes. Get in here and tell me all about it.
This didn't necessarily go down well with conservative and religious groups, in particular the Catholic Church, and the film industry faced the possibility of mass boycotts they couldn't afford. So in 1934, Hollywood began to enforce the Motion Picture Production Code, also known as the Hays Code. This was a list of restrictions on what could be shown in a film that had technically been in effect since 1930. This was not just done to placate the Catholic Church, but also to dissuade the government from stepping in as an external censorship force. The code established a list of don'ts and be carefuls in film that encompassed things such as provocative dances, to scenes of childbirth, men and women in bed together, open-mouthed kissing, and this one is wild, white slavery. It sought to take moral nuance and make it black and white. Therefore, good must always win, and evil must always fail. Among these and other restrictions, it also forbade the depiction of sexual perversion. Perversion being homosexuality, of course. To ensure adherence to this code, each script was carefully read line by the Production Code Administration and notes given on anything that violated that code. Due to how the industry was structured, it meant that a movie without approval from the Production Code Administration wouldn't get a commercial release. Consequently, queer characters were largely scrubbed from existence in US films. There were vestiges to be gleaned, however, and it wasn't pretty. Gone was Greta Garbo as Queen Christina in 1933, casually kissing a woman and proclaiming,
I shall die a bachelor.
And instead we got 1936 Dracula's Daughter, a vampire woman whose soulless eyes seem to devour the young woman who has come to pose for her.
Why are you looking at me that way? Won't I do? Yes, you'll do very well indeed.
And later looms over the damsel of the movie ominously. She may not be explicitly called a lesbian, but the implications are obvious. Her just dessert is received in the form of her death by the movie's end, and I imagine the sole reason such a portrayal was approved by the censors. This personification of evil was seen again in the 1945's House on 92nd Street, where the lesbian cross-dressing Nazi is shot dead in the final action of the film, and in 1950's Caged, where the matron of the woman's prison is characterized as being a little too interested in her charges.
Sit down in this chair, it's kind of roomy.
While also being a brutal bully, and for it, she is killed. A US movie which seemed to defy the negative portrayals during this era was Young Man with a Horn. Amy North is a mysterious, somewhat cryptic character who the male protagonist falls in love with. She marries him despite not enjoying his kisses nor wanting him to touch her. It's clear that this is not for her, and their marriage crumbles.
You're so confused yourself, you got me confused.
I'm not confused any longer. I'm fed up with you. I'm sick of you trying to touch me.
She seems to prefer the company of another woman.
I thought you were class, like a real high note you hit once in a lifetime. That's because I couldn't understand what you were saying half the time. You're a sick girl, Amy. You better see a doctor.
What makes this unique for the time is that there is no punishment, no comeuppance for her implied homosexuality. Films outside of the US offered only marginally more hopeful films during this time period. In 1936, the French film La Garçonne followed the story of a woman who escaped an arranged marriage and pursued a career as an artist. In the process, she falls into, and I quote, carnal temptations and artificial pleasures, one of which, apparently, is lesbianism. While the film has some shots of queer ladies in it amongst the general debauchery and opium smoking, and allusions to it are couched in vague enough terms that I was wondering how this was taken as explicit representation, but apparently it was. Being a French film, the ending is not deadly, however, it is merely heterosexual. The protagonist does not have to die for her temporary sapphism.
Je crois sortir d'un cauchemar.
Another French film, Club de Femmes, or Women's Club, offered a more explicit sapphic character. Based in a hotel for working-class girls, one of the residents finds herself attracted to a pretty, if vapid, girl. She allows her jealousy to drive a wedge between her crush and the boyfriend, and later, when her crush is defiled by the manipulations of the front desk girl, she turns to murder. And then she exiles herself to a leper colony. So perhaps not death, but one could argue the next worst thing to death, a life of misery and isolation, working with the world's most reviled and pitiable. The 1949 Swedish film Törst had a mentally unstable character teetering on the edge of seduction by a lesbian, something so awful she drowned herself. 1955's Diabolique tried to remove the explicit lesbian content from the source novel, but it resulted in sapphic subtext, with betrayal and death for one and jail for the other. The most positive film was Olivia in 1951, based off a semi-autobiographical novel. It was renamed to Pit of Loneliness in English before it would be approved for the US market, an attempt to echo what is generally acknowledged to be the first lesbian novel in 1928, Well of Loneliness by Radcliffe Hall, a novel which ended in suicide. Olivia follows a young student who has recently come to a boarding school, and she finds herself having a passionate attachment to her teacher. The teacher, Mademoiselle Julie, and her rival, Mademoiselle Cara, are implied to have been in a relationship together, and the film reads very queer. At the time, I'm sure the school came across as a hotbed for scandalous lesbian activity, which, as a modern sapphic viewer, makes this a delightful find. However, the ending did involve tragedy for one of the characters. The reason that this film was able to make it to the US was because by then the film studios had been court-ordered to sell their movie theatres in 1948, and it allowed for movie theatres to import and show foreign films without the need of US censorship approval. This marked the beginning of a loosening up of the rigid control the Catholic Church had over the US film industry. However, it would still be some time before the code would be abolished completely or that sapphic representation would flourish. As society's restrictive mores began to loosen in the 60s, the Hays Code had no choice but to adapt if it wished to retain an illusion of control. It didn't signal a sudden increase in positive queer representation, it just meant that it was more explicitly spoken about. The Children's Hour, the first lesbian film riding that change, had the lesbian hang herself because of how disgusted she felt at her sapphic feelings, echoing the sentiments of the time.
I resented your plans to marry. Maybe because I wanted you. Maybe I've wanted you all these years. I can't stand to have you touch me. Oh, I feel so damn sick and dirty. I can't stand it anymore.
But it did mark the beginning of a new wave of films featuring lesbian characters. Along with the type of sapphic characters we've seen until then, there was now lesbian-themed film like the French-Italian vampire film Et Mourir de Plaisir, or Blood and Roses, which came out in 1960 and based on the novel Carmilla. It was succeeded by other vampire films like Daughters of Darkness in the 70s. One of the more disturbing finds was Valerie and Her Week of Wonders, a Czech film with its 13-year-old protagonist in a surreal allegory of which had suggestions of sapphism. What I saw of this film as I researched left me feeling uncomfortable with its. Then there were films like Japan's Munji in 1964, looking at an obsessive lesbian affair with a tragic ending, and Les Biches, a threesome between two women and a man. These films can easily be seen as an extension of the patriarchal film industry as the sexual revolution of the 60s and 70s swept the world. None of these stories were there to explore what being a sapphic meant, but was there instead to exploit the idea of two women together. Now not only were queer women monsters, but sexy monsters. With representation being what it was, finding sapphic images of oneself was a dangerous business. The images were present, but also narrowly associated with death, destruction, and mental illness. With the weight of a world that viewed queer sexuality as a horrible perversion, where to find safe images, happy possibilities, how to imagine a positive future when every story denied that possibility. Enter Subtext. The taking of a story that is superficially heterosexual but is coded with certain telltale signs that speak to the queer experience. Ones that the general audience is unlikely to clock, but provide enough scope that a happy queer story is imaginable. These are markers that are not acknowledged in text, but are still tantalizingly present. Stories like 1933's Little Women with the tomboy Jo, who is independent and longs for adventure and self-determination, while her sisters seem happy to comply with expectations. This version of the classic story was played by Katharine Hepburn, a lesbian icon, with a decided androgynous edge to her, who would go on to play a gender-bending role in Sylvia Scarlett in 1935, where she dresses quite convincingly as a boy for a portion of the film. Then there was the palpable tension between Katharine Hepburn and Ginger Rogers in Stage Door, if one chose to see it.
And you're wonderful.
And you're wonderful.
And I'm wonderful too. Now come on, let me help you take off your things.
All About Eve also sported tension that could be interpreted as sapphic, and apparently Eve was originally conceived as a lesbian, but, well, censorship. 1952's musical Calamity Jane was a film dripping in sapphic possibility.
Gosh almighty. You're the prettiest thing I ever seen. Never knowed a woman could look like that.
It's unfortunate it also was such a hideously racist film. Calamity Jane is a gun-toting tomboy out in the Old West who can ride and shoot like a man. She seems quite taken with Katie Brown, and they become fast friends who move in together with exactly all the subtext you'd expect. The love interests that ensure a perfectly heterosexual ending aside, it's easy to imagine Calamity Jane singing a secret love about Katie. It's hardly surprising that such films became the favourite of sapphic women yearning for positive images of themselves. Here, there was hope, possibility, and safety from society's pernicious punishment of their queerness. Even as representation has improved, subtext has remained popular for sapphic women, even today. In 1968, just in time for the Stonewall riots of 1969, amidst the gay rights, women's rights, and civil rights movement in the US, the Hays Code was officially ended and replaced with the MPAA rating system that is still in use today. Ending the Hays Code was pivotal, and its effect quickly felt. While this was a code specific to the US, as an international leader in entertainment, it held, and still does today, a skewed importance in global storytelling. So it's not surprising we began to see some breakthrough moments happening around that time. But the next breakthrough didn't come from the movies, it came on television. It's the 70s. The Hays Code, which censored the US film and TV industry, has been abolished, and the impact of this change was quickly felt. In part 1, I didn't touch on television and its impact on queer representation, the reason being simple. Until the end of the Hays Code, there was very little queer content to be found there. Why? Because TV had been around for a lot less time, taking off only in the mid-1950s, and suffered under the same level of censorship as cinema.
Well, we hear a lot about censorship of the writer on TV. We've heard a good deal about it in your own case especially.
Well, depending, of course, on the thematic treatment you're using, if you have the temerity to try to dramatize a theme that involves any particular social controversy currently extant, then you're in deep trouble.
But all of that was about to change. To the best of my research, Australia was responsible for breaking taboos in 1970 when ABC's TV This Day Tonight, a current affairs program, aired the first ever interview of two lesbians, and later in the show also aired the first lesbian kiss. Phyllis Papps, one of the lesbians interviewed, said of it, "In hindsight, I think we were set up to create a stir and titillate TV viewers." And stir and titillate they did. Hello, editing me here. Since I first posted this video a year ago, I have since come to learn that the first sapphic kiss on TV was in fact on a Brazilian teleplay called A Calúnia in 1963. I couldn't find a clip of the kiss, but have linked an article in the description. But it would be another 4 years before the world saw its first fictional sapphic kiss. It was in Australia, once more, on the first episode of the new soap The Box that aired on the 11th of February 1974. The plot was suitably scandalous and sensational, using the kiss, no doubt, for ratings. The bisexual character of Vicky Stratford went on to appear in 206 episodes until its cancellation in 1977, making her the first recurring sapphic character on TV in the world as far as I'm aware. From the little I could gather about this character, she played into the troublesome trends often seen when bisexuals are portrayed, that they are manipulative, untrustworthy, and lacking morality. 11 days later, on the 22nd of February, the UK broadcast its first lesbian smooch on a teleplay called Girl with none other than Elizabeth Bennet's mother from the 1995 miniseries Pride and Prejudice. This teleplay focused on a young, pregnant army recruit who had to leave her post and end her relationship with her superior. I could only find a small clip of it, so I can't draw any conclusions about how they were framed. The director apparently called it a simple love story, even if it was a sad love story. Dr. Vicky Ball, a senior lecturer in film and television histories at De Montfort University, Leicester, however, said this: "Certainly the characterization of Harvey as a predatory corporal using her authoritative position to seduce new recruits in the women's army did little to help destigmatize lesbianism. As for US television, they would be almost 2 decades behind these first smooches, waiting until LA Law in 1991 to offer up a kiss on primetime TV." But before we skip too far ahead, let's see how representation evolved through the rest of the 70s and 80s. In 1973, homosexuality was removed as a mental illness by the American Psychological Association, and that simple reclassification opened up the possibility to explore more sympathetic storylines, and by then, television had become a staple in the homes of many countries. As outlined in The Celluloid Closet by Vito Russo, television programming, scheduled for nearly 24 hours a day, was in constant need of social issues to deal with, homosexuality among them. A film may have to be a hit, but when a television show flops, there is always next week and another subject, so experimentation was encouraged. Pressure by gay liberation directed the course that television would take regarding the representation of homosexuality for the American viewer, and it succeeded in obtaining a more balanced and certainly more prolific dialogue on television than in film. Within a few years, beginning in 1972, television presented a more vibrant and diverse portrait of gay America than had ever been seen in the entire history of American film. One such movie was a 1976 PBS teleplay called The War Widow. It was a desexualized but nonetheless genuine depiction of a lesbian romance. It's set during World War I, while Amy's husband is away fighting, and being of the old world order and a dutiful wife, her life has seemed to stop in the wake of his absence. But she begins to find her own purpose when she makes a new friend who opens her up not just to new ideas but also to a new love. If Carol, with its ambiguous ending, is considered to have a happy ending, then this one does too, effectively giving what appears to be the first ever positive portrayal of lesbianism. This beats out the happy ending of the first lesbian movie, Desert Hearts, by 9 years. This was also followed 2 years later by A Question of Love in 1978, looking at the custody battle when a woman and her kids move in with her female lover. These movies, like Liana and Desert Hearts, began to form a new wave of storytelling that offered genuine looks at the lesbian reality, stories that went beyond villainy, shock value, or titillation. Although those stories were still being made, at least they were no longer the only voices being presented. The 80s was a slow decade, impacted by the AIDS epidemic, but did offer up a few moments of note. Along with the first lesbian film with a happy ending, Desert Hearts, and the first images of black queerness in the colour purple, it also introduced the first recurring lesbian character on US TV on Hill Street Blues in 1986. She first appeared in season 5 and recurred until the end of the series in 1987 with a pretty neutral portrayal. She was single throughout her run and was only a minor character within the show. There wasn't a lot else that I could find. Lesbian representation in the 80s on TV was like looking for water in the desert, especially when compared to the list of special episodes focusing on gay men during that period. Unsurprisingly, perhaps, because the film industry had systematically and very early on shut out female voices from telling their stories. Perhaps it is no surprise then that lesbians read into shows like Laverne and Shirley, a comedy about 2 friends who live together, Cagney and Lacey, a drama about 2 female cops, The Facts of Life, a comedy with the spicy tension between the queer-coded Jo and her eventual best friend Blair, or Thelma and Louise, a road trip romp of 2 women throwing off the patriarchy. But things were progressing, and the 90s were about to see some important shifts in sapphic representation. The 90s saw an explosion of independent filmmaking that didn't wait for the funding from big studios and instead found distribution through festival circuits to then get theatre releases. For example, Go Fish was made for $15,000 US and was sold through the nascent Sundance Film Festival in 1994 for almost $500,000. While the 70s had seen some experimental queer films with the likes of Je, tu, il, elle, this new wave of queer cinema offered the opportunity for queer female voices to author their own narrative for the first time on a larger scale. This meant more diverse voices too. I hope you'll noticed how cis and white everything has been up to this point. The 90s saw the arrival of The Watermelon Woman, a black queer film made by a black queer woman. It offered a lesbian trans woman in the film Better Than Chocolate. It explored a non-Western cultural paradigm in films like Fire. The happy endings that evaded sapphic depictions for over 60 years were no longer elusive, and sapphic audiences were hungry for these films that were made by and for them. B. Ruby Rich, a scholar and critic of queer cinema, coined the term New Queer Cinema in 1992 to describe this wave of movie making which centered unapologetic, anti-heteronormative portrayals of LGBTQ communities. They were often depicted as being on the edge of society as they embraced their identities. Not surprisingly, the films of that era were again largely focused on gay men, and those were the films that found funding when it was to be had, meaning that the sapphic films of this era are clearly of the lower budget variety, a trend that would follow lesbian cinema through the following decades. While cinema was seeing something of a revolution, television was stagnating through most of the 90s. The 1991 LA Law kiss I mentioned began a trend of lesbian kisses for the purpose of shocking or enticing the viewers for ratings. Among the best-known shows to do this was Picket Fences, Roseanne, Friends, Party of Five, Ally McBeal, and Sex and the City.
It wasn't bad. Kind of like chicken.
And for the majority of the 90s, these instances made up the majority of lesbian representation on TV.
What the hell was that? Just wanted to see what all the fuss was about. And? I've heard better.
Other than that, there were a few events of note. In 1994, the UK soap Brookside featured a positive sapphic lesbian storyline, making it the first soap to ever do so. Then there was Friends, which had Ross's ex-wife in a long-term stable lesbian relationship and shared custody of their son throughout the run of the show. They even had a lesbian marriage, albeit no kiss. With so little explicit representation, the major sapphic fandoms for the decade once again fell to Subtext. There was, of course, Xena, which really was Subtext in name only to appease the networks. There was Talia and Susan on Babylon 5, which, like Xena, was as gay as it could be without saying it. There was also ships that the creators didn't deliberately set out to make, like Janeway and Seven on Star Trek Voyager, and Kira and Jadzia Dax on Star Trek Deep Space Nine. Unlike previous decades, the fans of these pairings had the internet, which allowed sapphic audiences to connect in new and exciting ways through forums and the sharing of fanworks, essentially giving them a voice they'd never had before to create a shared interpretation of a text. Of the sapphic voices of that decade, one changed the landscape of queer representation indelibly: Ellen DeGeneres. With the accusations of toxic workplace behavior that surfaced during 2020, Ellen's affable public persona has taken a nosedive in popularity and is no doubt closely linked to the cancellation of her daytime talk show after 19 seasons. The hypocrisy of touting a mantra, "be kind," but then abusing her staff, is something I don't think she'll publicly recover from. That said, she had single-handedly done more for normalizing queer representation than any other public figure, and it's impossible to talk about a history of sapphic representation without including her in a video like this. She made a name for herself as a stand-up comedian. She was introduced to a wider audience on the Carson Tonight Show in 1986, when she did her Phoning God routine to great success. This introduced her as a funny, non-threatening, tomboyish, all-American girl next door, and audiences took to her. Eventually, this led to her own popular sitcom called Ellen, which then led to her coming out both as herself and as her character on the show in the Puppy episode at the end of her 4th season in 1997.
I mean, why can't I just say the truth? I mean, be who I am. I'm 35 years old. I'm so afraid to tell people. I mean, Susan, I'm gay.
This was the first time that a celebrity of her status had ever publicly come out, forcing the English-speaking world to confront homosexuality more directly than ever before. She came out on the cover of Time magazine. She was publicly in a relationship with Anne Heche at the time, and they both appeared on Oprah. She was interviewed by Diane Sawyer on the Current Affairs program 2020. More high profile could not have been possible. Then, in short order, Ellen Morgan on the sitcom also came out. The initial response by Hollywood seemed to be one of support. The ABC network, a division of the Walt Disney Channel, more or less supported the move, and there were a number of celebrities who took on cameo roles. The two-part coming out episode featured Laura Dern as a love interest, Oprah as the therapist, musician Melissa Etheridge and Katie Lang in guest spots. The following season saw a slew of celebrity cameos. Emma Thompson and Sean Penn even did guest roles playing gay versions of themselves in a real power move in season 5. Ellen had support within the industry, but alas, the industry is a business. With declining ratings, advertisers running scared, fervent religious pushback, and the feeling that Ellen was being too gay with her sitcom led to its cancellation in 1998.
A year ago, DeGeneres said she was going to keep her audience comfortable and bring them along slowly on gay themes. And when we reviewed all 21 Ellen episodes, and this is subjective, 13 out of the 21 were primarily about gay themes. And the woman, who had been heralded as a brave trailblazer, was now being accused of going too far, too gay.
Being too gay meant Ellen spent a number of years barely working. It wasn't until she got her talk show and cemented herself on daytime television as the funny, kind lesbian next door that she found her footing in the industry once more. The show, beaming into people's living rooms on the daily, along with her relationship with Portia de Rossi of Ally McBeal fame, was incredibly influential in normalizing same-sex love. She helped people to feel comfortable with the idea of queer people. She helped to make it feel knowable and non-threatening. It would be hard to conceive a television landscape that could have allowed a show like Will and Grace to get made, or Willow and Tara from Buffy the Vampire Slayer to exist. The L Word for sure couldn't have been made without Ellen's contribution. It opened up the pathway for more varied and honest representations on the small screen. While the 90s was the time for the rebellious, offbeat, low-budget sapphic film, the aughts gave rise to some more polished film options. These films tended to copy mainstream formulas more closely, and it gave us some of the most beloved lesbian romance films in the canon. Imagine Me and You has all the elements of a mainstream rom-com. Saving Face, while lower in budget, offered a quality of film that was thin on the ground. I Can't Think Straight has been an enduring crowd pleaser. None of them broke out far beyond sapphic audiences, however. It was with The Kids Are All Right in 2010 that a sapphic-themed film finally got award recognition when it won a Golden Globe for Best Feature, Musical or Comedy. In the years since then, there has been other films that have garnered critical acclaim with sapphic themes. Blue is the Warmest Color in 2013, Carol in 2015, The Handmaiden in 2016, and Portrait of a Lady on Fire in 2019, showing that there is a mainstream appetite for these films. I did a video essay going into further depth about these award films, The Handmaiden in particular, so check out the card at the top of the screen for that. It's not in the realm of film, however, that the biggest strides have been made in the last 2 decades or so. Television as a medium has grown in importance, reflected by the budgets and scope of storytelling they're allowed. It only makes sense that important milestones in sapphic representation have taken place there. In 2004, the iconic lesbian show The L Word aired on the network Showtime, the first to look at the lives of an ensemble cast of queer women. Not only did it present sapphic women at the heart and centre, but allowed them to kiss and have sex without the desexualization that often accompanied positive, non-exploitative representation of lesbian love on TV, something lesbian sapphic audiences had long noticed as a double standard between queer and straight couples. It took Willow and Tara a season to kiss despite being in a relationship. They never got a proper sex scene. That would have to wait until season 7 between Willow and Kennedy. Meanwhile, Buffy and Spike were having sex all over the place. This trend was obvious in almost all media that followed too. Whether it was the teen drama South of Nowhere with a sapphic lead, or the sapphic storylines on soaps and telenovelas that rose in popularity through the aughts. Even when kisses were allowed or the ladies were allowed to share a bed, it was always less and more tentative than their heterosexual counterparts were allowed. Often it was due to fears of conservative audience backlash, where the sapphic storyline was, it felt, often designed for the comfort and education of the straight audience. During the 2010s, this issue became less marked depending on the country and network producing the show, with an overall trend towards more equal treatment of affection between sapphic women. It was about this time that discussions around queerbaiting began to enter into fandom discourse. Queerbaiting being in which creators hint at, but then do not actually depict same-sex romance or other LGBTQ representation. This occurred notably with the TV show Rizzoli and Isles, where the two central female protagonists in the first episode are having interactions like this.
Are we having a sleepover, or is this your way of telling me you're attracted to me?
And then went on to have episodes where they're in a gay bar.
Maybe I should be a lesbian.
Aw, well, wishes can come true.
Well, it's a good thing you're not my type. What do you mean I'm not your type? That is so rude.
The show very deliberately played on these elements while also declaring they were straight. Pitch Perfect had Becca and Chloe singing naked in the shower together, which, I mean, the writers had to know how that would play, right? Even if they didn't, the sequel clearly teased the dynamic with no intention of making their leads gay for each other.
You know, one of my biggest regrets is that I didn't do enough experimenting in college.
Ocean's 8 had to understand how Cate Blanchett and Sandra Bullock looking intensely at each other with suggestive dialogue would translate.
And you were there with me every step of the way. Oh, honey, is this a proposal? Baby, I don't have a timing yet.
At its most benign, this was creators misguidedly thinking it was fun, a nod and a wink for sapphic audiences. A more cynical perspective is they purposely played on sapphic women's hunger for representation to lure them into watching their content. While these instances seem particularly purposeful, there are a number of times where it was less clear if the creators intended a particular dynamic between two women on screen to be so damn gay or not. Emma Swan and Regina Mills from Once Upon a Time and Cara Danvers and Lena Luthor from Supergirl are examples of this, where sapphic audiences quickly picked up not only on a natural chemistry between their leads, but saw arcs between them that positively begged for the two to get together. Whether these instances were queerbaiting or not can be debated, but it is clear that prejudices are very much alive and kicking, preventing these shows from pivoting to capitalize on what has organically occurred. Exceptions to this have been Santana and Brittany on Glee, Root and Shaw on Person of Interest, and Eve and Villanelle in Killing Eve, where fan support and evident chemistry led to the pairings going canon. The endings of these last two shows I just mentioned feed into a more troublesome trend. I'm sure you can guess what is coming next: the bury your gays trope. The bury your gays trope refers to a commonly used storytelling technique of killing off queer characters. At its worst, this is done violently, let's say with a gun, by a male love interest who can't accept the object of his affections has chosen to love a woman, just as the women have gotten together. Like with Bianca and Marissa on All My Children. It could equally come in the form of a freak stray bullet like with Willow and Tara, or a freak stray bullet at Pepper and Sylvia's wedding. It didn't have to be gun violence, it could just as well be a bomb, stabbing, car accident, or a stroke, to name a few. Autostraddle has been keeping a list of these unfortunate events, link in the description below. This trope is not exclusive to sapphic characters, it also afflicted queer men too, perhaps most famously with Brokeback Mountain, a mainstream breakthrough film about gay cowboys, or most notoriously with Castile on Supernatural, confessing his feelings finally after seasons of hints and subtext, only for him to die and go not just to hell, but to super hell. That said, the trope seemed to disproportionately affect sapphic women. In an article by The Wrap looking at 27 deaths in 2016, the year that this issue gained international attention, 20 of the listed deaths were women, only 7 were men, and that wasn't in fact a comprehensive list for the year, as there were a total of 29 queer women killed off. I'm sure you can guess the reason for why women bore the brunt of this trope. It was the intersection of queerness and misogyny, which also had a term coined as a shorthand, women in refrigerators or fridging. This term originated in 1999 by writer Gail Simone in reference to male superheroes in comic books who had women in their lives maimed, killed, or otherwise disempowered to motivate their journey. This trend has not been limited to comic books, of course, but is prevalent throughout storytelling. Combining that with a history of deliberate censorship of queer women on screen that ended in tragedy, there has been an unconscious storytelling bias which makes these modern portrayals dispensable and ripe for killing off. As more sapphic portrayals were making their ways onto our TV screens throughout the 2010s, there had been a corresponding rise in queer women killed off. So, let's talk numbers for a quick minute. Just how many were being killed off? Using the Autostraddle list of dead queer women and GLAAD's annual report on queer representation on US shows, I calculated a rough percentage of how many queer women were being killed off over the years. I do want to note that I can't vouch for how accurate Autostradle's list is, and some changes in reporting by GLAAD and the fact it only looks at US-based TV shows also affected the accuracy, so it's more to get an idea of this trend over the last 8 years or so. With that said, the numbers are revealing. From 2014 to 2016, the percentage of dead lesbian women were consistently around 20%. From 2017 onwards, however, this number dropped to around 8%, with last year's report now sitting at 2%. So, what happened to cause such a significant drop in the number of dead queer women on our screen? I feel the majority of you will know the answer to this: the sapphic pairing of Clexa on the 100. In 2014, the TV show The 100 introduced the character of Lexa and proceeded to do an enemies to lovers storyline with the lead of the show, Clark, over the next couple of years. This pairing was incredibly popular, especially with young queer women who, perhaps for the first time, felt represented on screen by this couple. It resulted in a fervent and vocal online fanbase. But in March 2016, just as the couple had finally consummated their relationship, Lexa was killed off by, and you guessed it, a stray bullet. There was a huge fan outcry which led to trending Twitter tags, to fundraising for the Trevor Project, which focuses on suicide prevention for LGBTQ youth in the US, and to numerous online articles looking more closely at the bury your gays trope. Lexa's death was only the beginning of a high body count for the year, and as each new sapphic character died, the outrage at how easily dispensable they were solidified the sentiment that it had to change. Major publications picked up on the news, helping it to spread into mainstream discourse, and it had a tangible effect. Over the next 6 years, even as queer representation has increased, the number of queer deaths has dramatically dropped. It's a tangible win for sapphic representation, in the US at least. The diversity of these characters have also significantly increased on all fronts, be it ethnic diversity, disability, trans, or non-binary representation. Ace representation appears to be the one outlier. A reason, I think, for this trend is due to the rise of online streaming. TV series have been able to be more diverse because they don't need to appeal to the masses the way they used to. I think this is well epitomized in the recently released TV series A League of Their Own, with its diverse characters, diverse identities, and diverse creative team. A show like this could not have been made 10 years ago. This would be a wonderful place to end this essay. However, I think it's important to note that in spite of these leaps made, a trend has begun to emerge around TV series with sapphic leads. Here I'm referring to the high volume of shows that have been cancelled with sapphic women in lead roles this year. With the cancellation of shows like Batwoman, Gentleman Jack, The Wilds, Motherland Fort Salem, Legends of Tomorrow, and more, it's become apparent that when networks and streaming platforms make decisions on which shows will make it and which won't, it's these shows first up on the chopping block. The reasons behind this are perhaps not as simple as straight-out homophobia. Streaming platforms have very different revenue models to traditional television, and how statistics like completion rates for a show are interpreted and how that plays into decisions to renew a series is not transparent, as seen by the surprise cancellation of First Kill, which was trending in the top 10 most watched shows on Netflix for a time. When put up against a comparable show in terms of performance with a gay male lead on Heartstoppers, also on Netflix, that creeping concern that sapphic women are once again experiencing a raw deal is hard to ignore. Rowan Ellis did a deep dive on this topic, which is well worth checking out. In over 100 years of cinema and 70-odd years of TV, the way sapphic women have been portrayed has significantly improved from beginnings where we were either erased or treated as evil, wicked, and worthy of death. But it's clear that we are still not, even in the most progressive countries in the world, on equitable footing with our heterosexual counterparts. If recent repeals around trans and abortion rights in the US are anything to go by, and let's be clear that the US has been setting some worrying international trends, it signals how tenuous our position is, both in terms of gaining sapphic representation and in terms of retaining hard-won rights and acceptance in society. Feel free to share your thoughts on this history of sapphic film and TV. Check out my other videos, and until next time, lady lovers.